Have you ever imagined living in a land where religion dictated every aspect of life, from what you ate to whom you married? And what if I told you that in Canaan, one of the most intriguing civilizations of antiquity, the first wedding night didn't always belong to the husband? Yes, it sounds absurd, but this was just one of the many extreme practices that took place in this land marked by war, rituals, and a controversial culture. And before you think this is just an unusual detail in history, know that this tradition was part of a system where rulers and priests controlled not just land, but also bodies and beliefs. Canaan was no ordinary civilization. Located between gigantic empires like Egypt and Mesopotamia, this land was a strategic point, coveted by kings and conquerors. But what was most striking was not just its location, but its customs. The daily life of the Canaanites was a reflection of their faith and social structures, many of which were seen as morally questionable even by neighboring peoples. Among them was the right of priests or rulers to have access to a bride before her husband, a practice that, believe it or not, had deep roots in religious rituals and the power structures of the time. And don't think this was a hidden practice. On the contrary, it was a widely accepted and even revered norm in certain city-states. For the Canaanites, this custom had a purpose: to ensure the blessing of the gods over the marriage and to reaffirm the authorities' control over the people. But this was just one of the shocking aspects of a society that merged faith and domination in ways that few can imagine. To understand how all of this worked, we need to dive into the daily lives of these people, the power structures that upheld these traditions, and the impact that the arrival of the Hebrews had on this system. But this isn't just a story about a strange and controversial custom. It's also about how power can be used to shape beliefs and influence entire generations. What happened in Canaan was a reflection of a structure where faith was used to justify various forms of control. And the most disturbing part? Elements of this same pattern of manipulation still exist today, just under new forms. The question is, how many people actually realize it? So if you think you already know everything about antiquity, get ready to uncover details that are rarely mentioned. Life in Canaan was much more than just battles and farming. It was a stage where religion, power, and customs intertwined in ways that still echo today. And once you understand how it all worked, you might start to notice patterns you never saw before. Before we continue, if you like our videos and feel that they have blessed your life, like and comment, even if it's just an amen. This makes a huge difference for this content to reach more people and impact lives. If you are not yet subscribed, take the opportunity to subscribe, activate notifications, and share with those you love. Help spread this message of faith and hope. Each like, comment, and share strengthens this work, which we do with all affection to edify your life. Together, we can reach even more hearts. Continuing. If there was ever a place where the ancient world thrived with trade, culture, and war, that place was Canaan. Imagine a strip of land squeezed between two giants, Egypt, with its vast empire and immense wealth, and Mesopotamia, the birthplace of some of the most advanced civilizations in history. This small territory was not just a point on the map, but the beating heart of trade routes where merchants carried spices, precious metals, and fine fabrics. But along with wealth came conflicts. After all, whoever controlled Canaan controlled the strategic passages between the great empires. Everyday life in Canaan was shaped by this intense movement of people and cultures. Different nations crossed its roads, each bringing their own religion, extreme practices, and controversial beliefs. The Canaanites, the Philistines, the Amorites all fought for land and influence. Urban life revolved around city-states, which were small but heavily fortified. These cities were independent, constantly rising and falling depending on who was in power and which empire had its eyes on their conquest. But it wasn't just politics that made Canaan a battlefield. Culture in this region was a melting pot of influences. Have you ever considered how religious traditions shaped society? Here, rituals were not just symbolic ceremonies, they dictated people's lives. From human sacrifices to ritualistic prostitution in temples, everything was part of their connection with the gods. To us, this may seem bizarre, but to them, it was the only way to secure good harvests and protection from their enemies. War was constant, and there was no room for naivety. With massive walls and advanced defense systems for their time, Canaanite cities were fortresses, requiring elaborate strategies to be conquered. But unlike unified empires, Canaan was fragmented. Each city's rulers prioritized their own power, making it impossible to coordinate a defense against external threats. And this lack of unity was precisely what paved the way for the arrival of the Hebrews led by Joshua, and this is where history becomes even more fascinating. The Israelite conquest was not just a territorial war, it was a clash of worlds. On one side, the Canaanites, with their controversial religion and ancient practices. On the other, the Hebrews, bringing with them a new faith, a single God, and a moral code that directly collided with everything Canaan represented. The war wasn't just fought with swords and spears, it was also a battle of ideas. And when cultures as different as these collide, something extraordinary is about to happen. Archaeology helps us better understand this transition. Records show burned cities, destroyed idols, and shifts in settlement patterns. The decline of Canaanite culture coincided with the emergence of the first Hebrew communities. The evidence is clear. Something drastic happened during this period, but what exactly led to the downfall of the Canaanites? Was it merely the military strength of the Hebrews, or was there something greater at play? Well, the clues lead us to an even more intriguing scenario. And if Canaan was already a place marked by disputes and transformations, what was daily life like for those living within these walled cities? How did people navigate their days amidst this whirlwind of events? That's what we're about to find out. Life in Canaan was nothing like our modern routine. Forget electricity, supermarkets, or paved streets. Daily life was slower, but full of challenges. Houses, usually made of mud and stone, were simple, with few rooms and terraces that served as sleeping areas at night. During the day, families were busy with survival tasks, grinding wheat, fetching water, cooking, and of course maintaining the religious rituals that to them ensured protection and prosperity. But it wasn't all work. Canaanite culture valued festivals and ceremonies that strengthened community ties. And who ran the household? The women. They were responsible for preparing meals, raising children, and managing the home. But don't be mistaken. This was no easy task. Cooking, for example, required grinding grains by hand, lighting fires without matches, and storing food intelligently to prevent spoilage. The men, on the other hand, worked in the fields, raised animals, or engaged in artisan trades. Some ventured as merchants, trading goods between cities. However, this balance wasn't always peaceful. Frequent wars often took men away from home for long periods, leaving women with an even heavier burden. Speaking of food, Canaan was a fertile land, but that didn't mean abundance for everyone. Wheat and barley were dietary staples, mainly used to make bread, an essential daily food. Figs, dates, and pomegranates added sweetness to an often harsh reality. Diluted wine was common, even among children, as water wasn't always safe to drink. But scarcity was a constant reality, and during wartime, rationing was necessary. After all, supplies could be looted or destroyed by enemies. Now, if there was one thing that dominated life in Canaan, it was religious rituals. Everything revolved around local gods, and every aspect of daily life was tied to a belief system. Want a good harvest? Offer a sacrifice. Struggling with infertility? Seek a priestess. This deep religious influence led to practices that in our eyes might seem radical. Ritual sex, for example, was part of fertility cults, while some ceremonies involved the use of hallucinogenic substances to enter trances and communicate with the gods. But Canaanites didn't just live by faith and work. Leisure also had its place. Board games were popular among the wealthy, and oral storytelling kept traditions and beliefs alive. Seasonal festivals were moments of celebration, filled with dances, music, and of course, rituals to ensure that the gods continued to favor the land. However, for those at the bottom of the social hierarchy, such as slaves or the poor, life was a daily struggle for survival. And what about marriage in this context? Well, this is where things get even more intriguing. Marriages were arranged, involving negotiations between families, but there was something even more shocking. The first night of the wedding didn't always belong to the husband. Yes, some customs dictated that a priest or ruler had the right over the bride before her husband did. Something that, to us, may seem outrageous, but in ancient traditions was deeply rooted. But how did this happen, and what were the consequences of this practice? This leads us to an even more controversial part of history. If there was one thing that defined survival in Canaan, it was the land. The region's fertile soil allowed for the cultivation of wheat, barley, figs, pomegranates, and dates, foods that not only provided sustenance, but were also deeply connected to culture and religious rituals. Farming work began before sunrise, as the intense heat made labor nearly impossible during the hottest hours. But what was harvested didn't belong solely to the farmer. Temples and rulers always demanded their share, whether in the form of tributes or offerings to the gods. Hunger was not uncommon, especially during times of war when fields were raided or burned. The diet reflected this direct connection with the land. Bread was the foundation of everything, made from wheat or barley and baked in rudimentary ovens. But don't think of it as the soft bread we know today. It was rough, dry, and often filled with literal sand, as the grinding stones left tiny particles in the flour. Olive oil was another pillar of the diet, used for cooking and even for lighting homes. Milk and its derivatives, such as cheese and curd, were consumed regularly, especially among shepherds who relied on livestock for survival. And wine. That was practically a necessity. In Canaan, water wasn't always safe to drink, so diluted wine was consumed even by children. The production process involved crushing grapes with bare feet in large stone vats, a labor-intensive job that, despite its difficulties, was surrounded by festivities. After all, wine wasn't just for quenching thirst. It played a crucial role in religious rituals. Festivals and celebrations weren't complete without wine, and in some cults, it was used alongside hallucinogenic substances to induce trance states. However, abundance was not for everyone. The decline of harvests was a frequent issue, caused by droughts, plagues, and constant wars. The poorest had to make do with leftovers, often surviving on thin soups made from wild herbs and scraps of stale bread. For the more privileged, there was meat and spices brought in by merchants. Eating meat, by the way, was a rare luxury, usually reserved for special occasions or for temple and royal feasts. Animal sacrifices were also part of daily life. It was common for oxen, sheep, and goats to be offered to the gods as a means of securing protection or forgiveness. These rituals were so deeply ingrained in society that even political decisions could be influenced by them. And for some deities, the offerings went beyond animals. Human sacrifices were an extreme practice used to demonstrate total devotion. But how did this impact daily life? Imagine growing up in a society where your harvest's success depended not just on your effort, but on the gods' acceptance. Where a plague in the wheat fields could mean famine, and a prolonged drought could lead to an entire city's collapse. Religion and agriculture went hand in hand, and those who didn't follow the rules faced not only material hardships, but also social punishments. But there was something even more unpredictable: politics. Whoever controlled the land controlled the people, and rulers and priests knew exactly how to use that to their advantage. If Canaan had been a unified land, its history might have been very different. But unlike neighboring empires, which centralized power under absolute rulers, Canaan was a patchwork of independent city-states. Each had its own king, its own laws, and of course its own ambitions. This meant that instead of forming a single strong nation, these cities were constantly at war, fighting over territory, resources, and influence. The lack of unity was a fatal weakness, and the neighboring empires knew it. Those who wanted to conquer Canaan didn't need to overthrow a single vast empire. They only had to exploit the internal rivalries. And if you think these disputes were minor skirmishes, you're mistaken. Wars were brutal, with looting, crop destruction, and the enslavement of entire populations. Many cities built massive walls to protect themselves, but that didn't stop them from being invaded by stronger armies. In times of crisis, temporary alliances were formed, but betrayals and sudden shifts in power were common. If today political agreements are hard to trust, imagine back then when a simple broken promise could mean the total destruction of a city. Religion also played a crucial role in this scenario. Each city-state had its own gods and temples, making unification even more difficult. Some cities worshipped deities of war, while others focused on fertility rituals and harvests. The disputes weren't just political, but also spiritual, reinforcing the divisions between them. To make things worse, kings and priests often supported each other, ensuring that power remained in the hands of a select few. Rulers weren't just military leaders, they held absolute power over their lands and were seen as chosen by the gods, making rebellion difficult. However, their authority was never guaranteed forever. If a king showed weakness, whether due to military defeats or natural disasters, rebellions and coup attempts quickly emerged. It was an unstable reality where a leader could be on top today and assassinated tomorrow. And with so many interests at stake, conspiracies within the royal courts were inevitable. Of course, wars didn't happen only among the Canaanites. The Egyptians and Mesopotamians constantly interfered in the region's politics, funding allies, bribing leaders, and, when necessary, sending armies to place rulers in power who would serve their interests. Canaan was a geopolitical battlefield, where any mistake could cost a city its sovereignty. And when the Hebrews arrived, bringing with them a unique faith and a new form of social organization, the impact was devastating. The arrival of the Hebrews further destabilized the region. Joshua and his people didn't face a unified army, but rather divided cities, some willing to resist, others open to alliances. Biblical accounts describe how cities were burned and kingdoms were overthrown, but what's most interesting is that archaeological evidence confirms significant cultural shifts. Canaanite culture was in decline, and a new people were taking its place. But how did the priests and kings react to this? This is a part of history that reveals the darker side of power. If there was one undeniable truth in Canaan, it was the absolute power of kings and priests. While kings ruled with an iron fist, priests controlled the temples and religious rituals that dictated every aspect of people's lives. There was no separation between politics and faith. Whoever controlled the altars also commanded the armies and the city's wealth. But leadership wasn't based solely on brute force. It was upheld by fear, mysticism, and often by extreme practices that ensured no one dared to challenge the established order. Questioning a king or a priest could be costly. Punishments ranged from exile to public sacrifices meant to serve as a warning. Canaanite kings were different from Egyptian pharaohs or Mesopotamian emperors. They did not rule vast empires, but instead governed independent city-states, each with its own monarch. However, despite being small, these rulers were highly ambitious. To maintain power, they formed strategic alliances, married off their daughters to other rulers, and when necessary, betrayed even their closest allies. After all, in a world of constant wars, loyalty was a flexible concept. If one city grew, too powerful and threatened another's sovereignty, conflict was inevitable. But there was something even more dangerous than war: religion. Priests were, in practice, just as powerful as kings. They didn't just interpret the gods' wishes. They dictated when it was time to go to war, to make sacrifices, or to impose new taxes on the people. Many temples functioned as true administrative centers, accumulating wealth that in some cases surpassed even that of royalty. And the people's faith was manipulated to maintain this control. Hunger? The gods were angry. A military defeat, a sign that more sacrifices were needed. And who decided all of this? The priests themselves, ensuring their place at the top of the social hierarchy. And if you think their power stopped there, you're mistaken. Some priests, especially those serving fertility deities, participated in rituals involving sacred prostitution and other acts that, to us, may seem unthinkable. Human sacrifices were practiced in specific situations, especially when it was believed that the gods demanded a greater offering to bring prosperity. Children, slaves, and war prisoners were often the victims of these gruesome ceremonies. For the Canaanites, this was a necessary cost to maintain the universe's order, but not everyone accepted this without question. The arrival of the Hebrews brought a direct clash with these beliefs. Unlike the Canaanites, the Israelites followed a single God who rejected pagan temple practices and condemned human sacrifices. This sparked a conflict that wasn't just military but also spiritual. The destruction of cities like Jericho and Ai symbolized the decline of a culture that had ruled Canaan for centuries. But the Canaanite kings and priests wouldn't give up easily. They tried to resist, form alliances, and even resorted to more extreme practices to prevent the collapse of their world. Archaeological evidence provides clear signs of this transition. Ruins of destroyed temples, shattered idols, and shifts in city structures indicate that something major happened. But the most intriguing part is that even after the Israelite conquest, some Canaanite practices continued for a time, resisting cultural changes. Their influence was so deeply embedded that it even left traces in Israel's own history. But how were these wars fought in practice? And what kind of fortifications did these cities build to try to stop their enemies? That leads us to another fascinating point. If Canaan was a land marked by constant conflicts, its cities had to be prepared for war. And defense started with architecture. The most important cities were surrounded by colossal walls, some several meters thick, with watchtowers strategically placed for surveillance. But these fortifications weren't just physical barriers. They were symbols of power, demonstrating the strength of their rulers and the wealth of their inhabitants. The bigger the walls, the safer the city, or so they believed. But as history proves, no defense is impenetrable. War was not an occasional event, it was a constant reality. Canaan lacked a unified army, and each city-state had to defend itself as best it could. Some hired mercenaries, while others relied on their own warriors. Battles were brutal, and capturing a city often meant exterminating its population or enslaving them. It was common for enemy armies to besiege a city for months, waiting for the residents to starve before launching an attack. If resistance was too strong, walls could be scaled, knocked down with battering rams, or even undermined to collapse onto the defenders. Canaanite armies used a variety of weapons, from bronze swords to spears and bows, but the most feared innovation was the use of war chariots. With reinforced wheels and pulled by horses, these machines allowed for fast and devastating attacks. Those who mastered the chariot had an advantage over armies that still relied solely on infantry. However, the narrow streets of Canaanite cities made these vehicles difficult to use inside the walls, so most battles happened in open fields before the enemy even reached the gates. But internal betrayals were just as deadly as external threats. It was common for cities to fall not because of military force, but due to conspiracies and broken alliances. During crises, some rulers preferred to open their gates to a promising enemy rather than endure a prolonged siege. In other cases, corruption weakened defenses, and bribed guards allowed rival armies to enter without resistance. Canaan was not just a physical battlefield, but also a political game where survival depended on strategies as sharp as the blades used in combat. The arrival of the Hebrews challenged this defense system. Biblical accounts describe the fall of Jericho, where its walls supposedly collapsed miraculously. But beyond the spiritual factor, archaeological evidence suggests that the city was indeed destroyed around the time of the Israelite conquest. Other cities, such as Hazor, also show signs of violent destruction, indicating that these conflicts were real and intense. The war between the Hebrews and the Canaanites wasn't just a battle for land. It was a confrontation between two completely different ways of life, beliefs, and social organization. But the fall of Canaan didn't happen overnight. Despite the Israelite conquest, many elements of Canaanite culture persisted and influenced the new inhabitants of the land. Some customs were absorbed, while others were fiercely opposed. But the big question is, how did the Hebrews manage to establish themselves in such a fragmented land full of powerful enemies? The answer lies in the Israelite conquest and the impact it had on Canaanite religion and way of life. The arrival of the Hebrews in Canaan was an event that completely reshaped the history of the region. It wasn't just about territorial conquest. It was a direct clash between two civilizations with opposing beliefs and ways of life. On one side, the Canaanites, with their fortified cities, controversial religious rituals, and fragmented culture. On the other, the Israelites, a nomadic people bringing a monotheistic faith and a different model of social organization. But conquering the Promised Land wouldn't be easy. Each city was a challenge, and the Hebrews had to fight, adapt, and endure in order to establish themselves in Canaan. The first major victory was the fall of Jericho. Biblical accounts describe how the Hebrews, led by Joshua, marched around the city for 7 days until its walls collapsed. This event marked the beginning of a fierce military campaign. But, contrary to popular belief, the conquest did not happen all at once. Some cities were quickly taken, while others resisted for generations. Throughout the process, alliances were formed, betrayals took place, and decisive battles shaped the fate of Canaan. The impact of the conquest was not only military, it was also cultural and spiritual. The Hebrews rejected the Canaanite gods, their pagan temples, and their extreme practices, such as human sacrifices and ritual prostitution. The confrontation between these belief systems was so intense that it resulted in the destruction of many Canaanite religious centers. However, some traditions persisted, and the struggle to maintain the purity of Israelite faith would remain a challenge for generations. After all, Canaanite culture was strong, and many Israelites ended up adopting certain local customs. But not all cities were destroyed. Some struck deals with the Hebrews, allowing them to settle in exchange for survival. Others were taken through strategic warfare, exploiting the region's political fragmentation. The lack of a centralized government among the Canaanites made conquest easier. Rather than facing a single, unified army, the Hebrews dealt with divided enemies. This allowed them to gradually establish themselves in the Promised Land. Archaeologically, there is evidence that supports this process. Many cities from this period show signs of sudden destruction, while others display significant cultural shifts. Pottery styles, settlement patterns, and even dietary habits changed with the arrival of the Israelites. Over time, Canaanite idols disappeared, replaced by a new society built around the worship of a single god. The decline of Canaanite culture was not just a consequence of war, but also of the profound transformation brought by this new identity. The conquest of Canaan was a long and difficult process. But even after settling, the Israelites would face new challenges. They were not alone in the region, and conflicts were far from over. The Canaanite past would continue to haunt future generations, and the echoes of this spiritual and territorial battle would be felt for centuries. But how do we know all of this? How does archaeology confirm this transition, and what really happened to the Canaanites? The answers lie in the remnants' history left behind. If there's one thing archaeology teaches us, it's that the earth holds secrets that history, books don't always tell. Canaan, with its cultural richness and constant conflicts, left behind deep marks, and the remnants of this era reveal much about the transition from Canaanite culture to the arrival of the Hebrews. Evidence of destroyed cities, modified settlement, patterns and shifts in religion are just some of the proofs that something extraordinary happened there. But did everything occur exactly as described in biblical accounts? Archaeology helps piece together the puzzle. Excavations reveal that several Canaanite cities experienced abrupt decline, coinciding with the period of Israelite conquest. Jericho, Hazor, and Ai are among the sites that show clear signs of destruction and abandonment. But the most interesting aspect is not just the destruction itself, it's what came afterward. New villages emerged, displaying a different way of life, without large pagan temples, without typical Canaanite idols, and with a strong emphasis on communal living. Archaeologists identify these changes as an indication of a new people, the Hebrews. Another fascinating detail lies in everyday objects. While Canaanites had a culture marked by sophisticated pottery and grand urban centers, Israelite settlements were simpler. Their homes were modest, without the elaborate decorations typical of Canaanite elites. Additionally, dietary habits changed. The absence of pig bones in Israelite excavation sites strongly suggests that the new inhabitants followed strict dietary laws, consistent with Hebrew customs. Temples and altars also reveal a great deal about this transition. Before, Canaan was a land filled with places of worship dedicated to multiple gods. But over time, these temples vanished. The Israelite religion rejected idols, which is evident in the fact that their communities did not build large statues of deities. This archaeological contrast points to a radical spiritual transformation in the region, one that confirms the impact of Hebrew presence. However, Canaanite influence wasn't completely erased. Certain cultural practices survived for a time, whether in architecture, language, or even in how the Hebrews conducted rituals. This kind of blending is common in historical transitions and shows that change wasn't immediate, but rather a gradual process. The Hebrews settled in Canaan, but they continued to struggle to maintain their identity in the face of local traditions. Archaeology gives us a real glimpse into these events, but many questions remain. To what extent did the Hebrews destroy Canaan? And to what extent did they adapt to it? What we do know is that this transition was one of the most significant moments in ancient history, a true turning point for the future of the region. But life in Canaan wasn't just about wars and conquest. Some aspects of daily life would shock even modern people, and one of the most controversial had to do with marriage customs. Now that you've uncovered the secrets of life in Canaan, here's the big question. How many times has history shown us that power can be used to manipulate, control, and shape the destiny of an entire people without them even realizing it? The Canaanites lived under a system where religion, politics, and culture were so intertwined that even the most intimate aspects of life were dictated by rulers and priests. But are we really that far removed from this kind of control today? Aren't there still traditions, beliefs, and social norms that shape our lives without us even questioning their origins? Looking back, we see that practices we now consider extreme were for them a way of life. Which brings us to another question. What behaviors do we accept today without question, simply because they are considered normal by society? History has a way of repeating itself, changing only the settings and the characters. But those who understand the past have an advantage. They can recognize hidden patterns and make more conscious decisions about the lives they want to lead. And now, after everything you've learned about Canaan, its customs, and the influence it had over time, tell me, what shocked you the most? Do you think traces of this mindset still exist in modern society? Leave your comment below. Your opinion could spark new debates on the topic. And if you want to keep exploring hidden mysteries, discovering truths that few people know, and deepening your understanding of historical and biblical topics, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications. That way, you won't miss any new content and can continue your journey of knowledge. Trust me, what's coming next will surprise you even more.